All right. Cool. Hello. Thanks everyone for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Gansell, and I'm the programming officer of the Royal Heraldry Society of Canada. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first installment of our 2026 online lecture series, which we actually recently given the title All Things Dexter and Sinister. Thanks for President Ian for suggesting the new name. Anyway, so this series was initially conceived in honor of the late Dr. Claire Boudreau, and it endeavors to make sort of innovative research on heraldry and historically adjacent topics more accessible and engaging to our members and the sort of broader heraldist community. Also, more information on our next lecture coming up, which features Dr. Emma Catherine Wilson on September 27th. Will be coming soon, so please keep an eye on your inboxes for details. Anyway, I'm honored to introduce today's speakers, Vivien Baumert and Noah Kim-Baumann. Vivien and Noah are research associates at the chair of digital history at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, where they work on the DFG-funded project Heraldic Identity in Context, and they're both preparing dissertations. Vivien's research explores pre-modern women's and gender history, the cultural and social history of identity and public history. And Noah's explores dynamic network analysis and visualization, machine learning-based network analysis, 20th century transit history, and the implications of large language models for historical scholarship. So today, Vivien and Noah will be discussing the project Heraldic Identity in Context, which is a collaborative digital research platform that enables large-scale, transparent analysis of heraldic devices across contexts and media. And they're also going to be examining how this infrastructure can be brought to bear on questions of gender history within heraldic research. So I would just ask everyone to just mute your mics during during Vivien and Noah's talk, but you're also welcome to unmute yourself when we open up to questions at the end. You can also leave questions for Vivien and Noah in the chat if you would like me to read them aloud on your behalf during the Q&A portion. Anyway, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Vivien Baumert and Noah Kim-Baumann.
There we go. I think that works. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for having us. And we're really happy to present for the Royal Heraldry Society of Canada and bring our topic a bit closer to everyone. As said, Vivien and I are both research associates at the chair of digital history in Berlin. And we work on a project together, Heraldic Identity in Context, which is funded jointly by the German and French research foundations. Just as a bit of context, the project itself is a bit of a continuation of a decade of research in coats of arms, where we've studied the coats of arms as a media of communication. And in the current phase, we're looking at identity, both personal identity and group affiliations in France and the Holy Roman Empire between the 12th and 16th century. The team itself is quite mixed. We bring in expertise in medieval and gender history, computational humanities, digital history, and some machine learning. And this is also why the lecture today will have two separate voices, two separate heads talking to you. Vivien works on mainly the gendered dimension of the heraldic communication, and I'm responsible for a digital research environment that we're developing, this database that I'll bring a bit closer during the talk and on which some of the project rests on. It might also be worth mentioning that the chair for digital history itself has strong heraldic roots, with Thorsten Hildmann having done his PhD in heraldic studies under Michel Pastoreau, including others. And I'd like to start maybe with a quick introduction in digital history, because I think it frames quite nicely, at least the work that we do together, and definitely the work that I do, and brings our concepts and ideas for why we're trying to approach heraldry in this way. The short version is that we use digital data and computational methods to study the past. We put a specific emphasis on understanding what computational methods do to the study of the past epistemologically. So how does it change the way we learn about and interact with the past? Before a historical source can be analyzed by a computer, it has to be turned into data. And so a lot of what we focus on is that process. What does it mean? It means making choices, that's for sure. What to record, what to leave out, how to structure it. And those choices all are quietly shaping what we can ask about our sources and our data later. So we treat them as a research problem in their own right, and we use this data and we structure it, we connect it to other historical information. Um, sorry, and it can be linked together and reused later. For the structure for today's talk, just quickly, Vivien will start with some insights into the material itself that we work with, how it survives, and how scholarship has treated it. Then I'll be going into some of the digital aspects of how we treat heraldic objects, how they become data for us, what decisions we make along the way, and the shared language we built for it, which is the ontology that we use. Then Vivien will take over and discuss some of the gender history aspects of heraldry and the questions that come out of that. And at the end, we'll come back together and connect that, look at what we actually are doing with the database that we're putting together, with the ontology that we're putting together, and how that might help answer some of these questions that we've raised today. So in the first theme, just want to already put some of my takeaways out there, and I'll do this continuously so that it sticks. Um, we want to look at the how heraldic objects are turned into data, what methods are available for that, and what we need to consider was the purpose of it all. If you take one thing from my section, I hope that it's this, that turning objects into data is an act of interpretation and not necessarily just preparation. And from that follows everything else that we do. It dictates the ways of keeping uncertainty in this process, instead of erasing that uncertainty, the shared identifiers we use, the shared ontology, and certainly for us, we hope to be able to answer questions about identity and gender, and that's what we're going to be talking about now as well.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. So to continue that, my contribution to our talk today stems from gender history, as has been repeatedly said, and the question you see on the slides of how we can unlock coats of arms as sources for the study of women and gender in the European Middle Ages, and how this approach to heraldry can contribute to our understanding of medieval societies. So, yeah, on our way to answering this question, we will look at the broader research tendencies, as I just said, and including the tendency to somehow overlook gender as an analytical category and women as a heterogeneous group of individuals who were active in heraldic practice. And we will also briefly survey studies which do include women and gender before discussing potential research questions, one of which is my PhD project, and so my personal approach to the topic of a gender history of heraldry, if you will. First, however, let's briefly talk about what we're dealing with and where we're actually coming from. When studying history, the first thing that we learn is that anything can be a source, provided that we approach it critically. And part of this critical approach to sources is the awareness that a source never exists in isolation from its environment, and the process of interpreting and analyzing it can therefore only function within and through its historical context. That is why our project is called Identity in Context. So for coats of arms, Werner Paravicini, a German medievalist, has articulated this very precisely, stating that coats of arms can carry different meanings across time, place, and social context, even when the design itself remains unchanged. In other words, coats of arms are, to cite Thorsten Hildmann, abstract cultural and social codes. And it's therefore not the image that gives the coats of arms its meaning, but the social, cultural, material, temporal, and geographical context in which we examine it. And not least of all, because coats of arms were visible almost everywhere and at all times, so touching the lives of contemporary viewers in their day-to-day experience, they can offer an alternative view of how people in the Middle Ages saw and made sense of the world, and how these perceptions and abstract associations differed depending on when, where, and who you were. So a central premise of the project, therefore, is that coats of arms communicated a variety of cultural and social concepts and phenomena, such as kinship, hierarchy, authority and power relations, identity, gender, and many different other concepts. And viewed as such, and via the hermeneutic principle, which I just described, coats of arms retain their intrinsic value as tools and resources for source criticism, but they also transform into genuine sources of historical inquiry themselves. And this cultural historical awakening, so to speak, so the awareness that coats of arms can be sources as much as they can be resources is definitely no recent development, although researchers in the 2010s have shown some revived interest in the subject of medieval and early modern heraldry as subjects of cultural history. For example, in the form of the Heraldic Studies series, which is edited by Thorsten Hildmann and Laurent Ablot. Check it out if you're interested. The latest volume on heraldry in the medieval city has just been released this year, actually. But, and this is a big but, even in this comparatively innovative and advanced branch of historical heraldic research, you will notice that there is very little research on women and gender. That is, gender specifically, the generation and maintenance, or also the dissolution of it. In short, the lived meanings and dynamics of gender in heraldic representation and communication, including, for example, ideas of masculinities. And spoiler alert, it's not all doom and gloom, but because, of course, a research gap also means that there's a lot of space for further exploration. But before we go into that, Noah will explain what it is that we are trying to achieve with digital history.
Yeah, so picking right up there, I would like to frame his digital history as an active modeling, and an active modeling that is also a hermeneutic act. And it is a decision of what becomes visible. We want to use coats of arms as sources for our investigation of medieval identity, which means we need to be able to bring together diverse sets of sources into a shared space and language, and the shared space and language so that they can be analyzed together. So we want to bring all these different materialities that you see on the slides here together so that they can be put into comparison with each other. And the goal is central to our project because we're looking at coats of arms, and the coats of arms should be findable, they should be analyzable, independent of the materiality on which they are and the context on which they come from. That information should be in the database, but we're looking at coats of arms not just from seals, not just from armorials, but theoretically also from all these different materialities. And that would require scouring thousands of different databases, different websites, and different archives. But the central goal for the digital history part of the project is to bring all of this together. And to do that, we need to be able to turn heraldic sources into data, which then gets stored in the database. And for our purposes, we're focusing on the coats of arms as the common denominator, but other projects would maybe choose a different part of the heraldic source to focus on. We have all of these different objects with heraldic information, and the question is, which part of an object, like the seal that you see here, should be recorded in the database? We have to make decisions. The object, for example, presents some materiality, presents text, coats of arms, an additional image, and all the information about its context, such as the seal carrier, the office of the seal carrier, the context of use, and the options for how to describe even the singular object are in a way endless. And we're having to make decisions. We call this process of decision making, data modeling, and we are modeling what parts of an object will get datafied. How do we go about data modeling? Well, it's important to consider that why are we doing this? For us, our research focus is medieval identities, and we want to offer interested scholars on similar topics a database so that they can be aided in their research. And by the way, when I speak of datafication, I mean creating information that is processable by a computer, like a laptop. This could be a text file, a Word document, a table, like an Excel, or other formats that might be harder for humans to read, but better for machines. A database is then the result of a specific set of interests, and we cannot capture everything about objects, so we have to decide what is relevant to our interests and to our questions. This is a process that involves selection and abstraction. Selection means that we have to select what parts of an object are important to us and which ones are not important to us. When describing heraldic sources, we have to decide the focus. For us, it's the coats of arms to inform medieval identity. But even at this level, we cannot describe everything about a coat of arms. So we make selections. An example of something we have not selected, for example, in our project is the orientation of the arm, its tilt, or the surface, or the degradation. These things were not necessarily uh, the most relevant for our project, and we could not cover everything, so we decided to select other aspects to cover. Abstraction is about how things that we did select actually get put into the database. And because we do not record things themselves, we record them through concept. The flower that is painted on here is going into the database as a rose. This particular shade of red becomes the gul, and this is exactly what makes the data useful because now I can ask for every coat of arm with a rose on it, and the database can answer me with 1,000 examples of different variations of this concept rose. But we should also be aware of what happens in that step. A concept is general, where the object is a particular. So everything that made this rose, one, the hand of the painter, the way it sits on the shield, falls away from our concept of rose necessarily. And the concept does not itself apply itself. Someone has to decide that this figure is a rose and not say cinque foil, and different people can and do decide differently. In our own corpus, the arms of the family Vergy exist in exactly this double state. We have one reading where it's the cinque foil and the others which say rose. So the same image has two different readers, two different concepts are related. And there are a few general elements that are part of the data modeling process. The selection, the abstraction, but they're very important, and it's important that we consider them when constructing a database. And once we see the datafication process, we're confronted by the next problem, and that is all about uncertainty and interpretations. In the interpretation of the historical record, we very rarely deal with outright facts, which might be more common in the natural sciences. Our descriptions of events, of objects, are normally interpretations that we have to find support for through our arguments, through different evidence, through other sources. And I will spend a little bit of time now talking about this overarching concept of uncertainty and how it affects our heraldic project and how we deal with it in a digital history manner. I'd like to start talking about um, the different kinds of uncertainty that we face. Ambiguity, vagueness, incompleteness are just some examples here. A clear example is, for example, ambiguity, and that's when we have a heraldic image, but the visualization of this heraldic image alone cannot lead to one clear, correct interpretation, but is ambiguous and allows for multiple different interpretations. For example, here we see different fish on different coats of arms images, and our goal would be to describe as clearly as possible what kind of fish is being represented. Sometimes this is possible through the visualization, as on the left, they're more specific renderings. but sometimes it's impossible, and there are multiple interpretations of what kind of fish this is. And this is a real problem for a database because a conventional field wants normally just one answer, and we need a way of describing that it can be a fish, but also descend into a smaller related concept like a barbel, only when the context earns it. And we do this through our ontology, which I'll get to in a minute, which is a hierarchy of concepts like fish and all these different subfish, building on the taxonomy. And I'll show you how it works in a few minutes. Just keep it in mind for now. The idea of vagueness is a second kind of uncertainty, and we deal with it very commonly. This is when a source is under specifies interpretation. For example, an armorial here informs us that these are the arms of Eberstein, but we do not know really what Eberstein refers to. Is it the family as a whole? Which family? Is it a particular branch or just one individual? The record is not wrong here. The armorial doesn't isn't incorrect. It's just less precise than we'd like it to be. And we need to be able to be precise when possible, but we also don't want to invent information where we don't have any. For our database, because it deals with identity, we really want to make sure that we're able to connect arms with entities. That could be individuals, that could be families, territories, or roles, but we need that relationship between arms and entities to investigate how medieval identities are being expressed through coats of arms. That's why we're currently focused on integrating heraldic sources that are more directly tied to entities, focusing on things like seals and gravestones and monuments, rather than armorials, which are harder to tie to specific entities and roles, depending on. A third common form of uncertainty is incompleteness, and this is when the record simply does not carry the information that we need. The armorials often attribute a coat of arms to no one at all. A painted shield carries as a reference with no name. And even when we have records, they are often patchy. Some persons exist in databases. You might find a person in Wikipedia or something like that. Or for us, it's very commonly the Germania Sacra, but they come with no life dates, such as date of birth or date of death or description. So we do not really know what we're connecting to with this name. And we cannot be certain that we're connecting the right person or the right family. Seals are a bit different because we have a seal normally always has its bearer and the legend, and that necessarily spells out who is sealing in this case and who can be associated with the coat of arms, therefore. And this one, for example, belongs to Isabeau de Bavière from 1418. I think the seal also shows a concrete case of incompleteness, of course, and we often deal with this kind of incompleteness in historical record when things are old, they have lost information that they did once carry through the effects of time, which also limits what we can say or interpret about a source. And one more thing I might want to mention before finishing uncertainty. We're, of course, also interested in identity, and part of the identity is gender. And there's so much uncertainty you deal with when you're discussing medieval gender. And that's something we're dealing with as well right now, and in terms of incompleteness, vagueness, ambiguity, all of these things. So how are we trying to figure out any of this? What are we trying to do with actual database? Well, we still have to put something into the database. So the question is not how do we get rid of this uncertainty, but it's how we assert things without erasing the reality that the points we make are assertions and not necessarily facts. And example my colleague Philip Schneider likes to use is Jacques de Bourbon, who's Count of La Marche, in the Armorial of the Golden Fleece. The bend here carries three little lions, and whether they are pastel or rampant is not settled necessarily, and competent readers have read it both ways. A conventional database would force one answer and reject another reading. In our model, both readings are recorded, so we have two description acts. As part of the database is not just the entity itself, but the act of describing the object. And these are description acts. So on the same painted shield, there's two descriptions, each with its author, and so we know who is making different assertions about the objects that we're adding. Identifications works exactly the same way. We have coats of arms attributed to Philip the Good and the same one to Charles the Bold. And when person identification is unclear, we again have both of these entity attribution acts in that case. This is something, the name for this kind of record, these kind of acts of attribution, is known as a factoid, and it comes from the field of digital cryptography. A factoid does not want to say that this is true, this description is true, but it says that this person claimed this on the basis of these sources with these methods and has this kind of level of certainty. Those are all the things that could be part of this attribution act or description act. And so this factoid model is really part of our database and how we model the data that we have. We found ways of keeping uncertainty in the data with these description attribution acts, but for acts like this to work, for two readings of the same shield to sit side by side without producing chaos, the descriptions themselves have to be built from a shared vocabulary, shared defined concepts. And of course, we have that in heraldry quite clearly. And this is also what our ontology is trying to give us. It's something slightly more complex than a table. It's also more complex than taxonomy. It builds on both of these things, though, because everything stands in a relationship to each other in an ontology. I'll explain that quickly. The technical definition is that an ontology is an explicit formal specification of shared concepts. Unpacking that, it means it's an abstract model of concepts of a domain, in this case, heraldry, and their relations. Every term in it should be defined, and the whole thing is machine readable, so a computer can work with it. And it is agreed by a community rather than one private person. You can think of it as a vocabulary and grammar that we agree on before we start recording claims. And it's important you do not build one by trying to describe everything in the world, as we've talked about. It's important that you develop so-called competency questions, and that's the questions that you are clearly defining to answer your bigger overarching question. For us, it's things like which persons used which combination of coats of arms in which source contexts. From the questions, you derive the concepts then that you need then. And I hope you notice that this is the same thing I described at the beginning. It's a process of selection and abstraction. It's just made systematic with reasons written down for which selections and abstractions we're making. Our ontology has four parts. We start with an object ontology, where we're describing the actual objects where heraldic information can be on, such as memorial books or seals or monuments. Then we have a representation ontology, and this is where we describe the context in which a coat of arm is in the object. So one could think of a ceiling and describing the space of the ceiling and how a specific coat of arm fits next to other coats of arms in that space, where it's positioned, and what information that position carries. Then we have our heraldry ontology, which I'll go into a little bit, which actually describes the coat of arm itself. And we have an entity module where we describe the different kind of entities that can be associated with coats of arms. The digital heraldry ontology, so the part of our ontology that deals with the coat of arms themselves, was mainly developed by Philipp Schneider and Thorsten Hildmann, and it currently carries around 1,300 concepts. There are, of course, the fish concept from earlier, subgrouped and organized hierarchically, so that a fish is a type of charge, and a fish is a type of animal. And below the fish, we have different species like barbels, salmon, flounder. And so a record can be honestly said where we can say that this image, for example, is a fish if we're not sure what kind of fish this is. And if we're sure, we can say we put barbel. So there's a hierarchy of options there. We're not trying to invent any new claims. The procedure to get to this heraldry ontology was a bit more straightforward in the sphere of heraldry than it is in other kinds of ontologies when we're describing other kinds of historical information, because heraldry offers already such a distinct corpus of descriptions of classes with blazoning. We have such a clear language that can be built upon. And so we break down a coat of arms, for example, and we develop different classes. That's what these different descriptions are called from it. The class structure itself um, can look very, very different. For example, here we have uh, top level arrangement. We have the charges, we have the direction, we have field, we have line, pattern, tincture, and such things. Um, these are not always the same thing, and we need to be clear in descriptions because sometimes we're working with the visual medium itself, but sometimes we're just working with the textual description. If we're not clear with the language, as with all blazoning, then we will have problems. Um, these classes must be structured in a certain way, depending on the functionality that they fulfill in the description of coats of arms, such as pattern and charge, of course. And modifiers must also be recorded so that we have clearness there. And we build also on top of the phenomenological taxonomies that exist as described with fish, not just fish, but all different kinds of animals and different things that make up charges, especially. And that just lends a logical hierarchy um, that are accessible now through our database. Another important part is that we, through the ontology, can add a dimension of multilinguality to these definitions. We have in blazoning all these different traditions in German, French, English, a shared vocabulary, but that has to be put together. And that's what we're trying to do so that we have shared concepts. Each class that we have in the ontology should be defined in the different traditions that we have, so that when we work with the ontology, we do not have to use just English heraldic terms, but we can also blazon in French and German, and our coats of arms still remain consistent as they all work together using the same heraldic concepts, which is in the middle there. Um, the same also works for attributions, identifications, and assignments to coats of arms. I can assign the same material representation of coat of arm to different people if there were ambiguities in the historical perspective in this regard. And again, here we're at the factoid theme again, which means the machinery is now complete. We have these shared concepts through the ontology, and we have the claims that are tied to authors. What we don't have yet is what can we do with all the stuff? What could we do with all the data that we've collected? Which questions are worth asking, and how do we approach it with identity? And for an initial insight, I'd like to hand over to Vivien now.
Thanks. Yeah, there is a huge spectrum of interesting questions worth asking, which I will get to in a minute. But before that, let's have a quick look at what gender history means, or at least what it investigates. On the slide, you see a definition of gender history, which I find comparatively comprehensive. It's hard to define these things. So historically, gender history, as we study and teach it today, can be said to have derived from feminist endeavors to restore women into historiography. And since then, the discipline has diversified immensely. Among other things, it's now transcending binary constructs of gender, namely female and male. So essentially, gender history deals with gender as a category, a useful category. Those of you who know have ever read anything by Joan Scott will know gender as a useful category. And a category of social difference, especially gender history then deals with power relations and dynamics, as well as subsequent exclusions throughout all the ages and areas of human life and action. And because gender history is interested in mechanisms of exclusion, especially, it encompasses and engages with women's history, queer and trans history, histories of sexuality, disability, ethnicity, and many more. And for the Middle Ages, specifically, we find ourselves confronted more often than not with confusion, looking at the diversity of social categories that many see as the product of our present time. There's a bit of skepticism when looking at intersectional epistemic interests, especially, which then lead to us often being criticized as anachronistic and our interest as being irrelevant to medieval life, which is another debate entirely, but absolutely central to approaching inclusive medieval historiographies and methodologies. So if you want to go deeper into the specifics of what it means to study gender in the European Middle Ages, I recommend reading Studying Gender in Medieval Europe by Patricia Skinner, which is not to say that I agree with everything she says, but it's still extremely comprehensive and not least of all, very readable. So for my interest in medieval heraldry, gender as a category of difference becomes not only effective because women, the self and externally gendered group that interests me personally, have been overlooked in heraldic research, but because coats of arms can, among other things, tell us how rigid the gendered power relations and hierarchies we associate with the Middle Ages really were. And from a completely different perspective that is beyond textual evidence. And I'm not the first to be interested in female heraldic practice. Although studies are comparatively far and few in between, I luckily don't have to start from scratch, which I'm really grateful for. So what stands out when looking at the European research landscape, particularly, is that German language research is not represented at all, and that we are dealing predominantly with desiderata from women's history specifically. That is, case studies that examine actual heraldic practice of women. And although, as the history of gender history itself makes clear, the examination of women gives rise to more inclusive questions that can ultimately make European cultural and social history more complete and inclusive, there's still somewhat of a lack of a bit of reflection concerning gender as an analytical category. To my knowledge, only Sophie Harwood in 2017 and before her Marie Grégoire have explicitly appealed for research into women's heraldic practice. And based on conversations over the past few months, I would say that there's something of a consensus and definitely an awareness for the lack of research in that field. So why then is there so little research? I would say it's not due to the sources. We have thousands and thousands of those, but rather due to bias, from which even we as historians are not immune, and which oftentimes clouds our understanding of, coming back to what Noah has teased earlier, of which sources we feel are relevant and which are worth investigating. So I would like to briefly address a bias in research, but also in extra academic heraldry that I think should be overcome so that we can research coats of arms from a gender historical perspective. And of course, there's the fundamental issue of normativity and normative sources, which is a tension that is by no means only applies to gender history. That means questions such as to what extent can a source be considered normative when the norm in question is primarily shaped by European patriarchal societies, where then people deviating from this constructed norm necessarily appear more as an exception than a rule. And then, of course, by means of which sources can the lived realities of non-male historical actors really be researched. But when looking at coats of arms as sources specifically, another bias I think is even more effective, and that is that of male coding. Coats of arms are extremely male-coded sources, and this, as I see it, stems from two central associations that implicitly exclude or marginalize women. So for one, there's a stereotype that stems from the origins of coats of arms, which we find in practical warfare, as you all know, and in the business of tournament, which means coats of arms as signs of knightly distinction, identification, and representation. So in a nutshell, the assumption was, I think, battle and tournament was the business of men, so why would women have needed coats of arms? And of course, the use of coats of arms certainly differentiated over the centuries, and the socio-representative factor became ever greater, with coats of arms increasingly becoming a medium of everyday communication. And that is one aspect. And on the other hand, and with this, we move into a pattern that is far more present in academic research than that of the knight, which is that of genealogy and representation in, oh, I think we're missing a slide. No, we're not missing a slide, sorry. I was confused by the color. No, the agnatic kinship slide is correct, Noah. Sorry. Yeah, so that is the second issue, I believe, that of genealogy and representation in the male line. We read in the heraldic classics, for example, that when a woman bears a coat of arms, she does so with the intention of representing her family, more precisely her father and her husband. And yes, it's true that many coats of arms worn by women represent alliance or marriage. That is, those that usually consist of paternal arms on the heraldic left and the marital arms on the heraldic right. And on the slide, you see a nice example of that, a contemporary depiction of Eleanor and Isabella of Austria, whose arms are lozenge-shaped, and which also leave the half assigned to the arms of the future husbands empty. I think, however, to assume that this constitutes the rule would require a good deal of temporally and geographically diversified research, which at this point we do not have. And even if it really were the case that women primarily carried the arms of male relatives, which, considering patriarchal structures, would be plausible, of course, it would nevertheless, I think, be a mistake to claim that women found no independent use or communicative value for these arms. Because, as we recall from earlier, coats of arms, even when they remain visually identical, mean different things for different people. And particularly from a perspective of a history of mentalities, for example, one would then have to ask, is it not all a matter of perspective? Wouldn't she, the woman, first and foremost see her coat of arms as a reflection of herself, and only then as that of her family, her father, her husband? How does this sense of self and its heraldic representation change once the woman's marital status changes? Are there also examples in which the man adapts his arms after marriage, etc., etc.? And of course, there are numerous further questions which arise from this, a few of which I presented here. First and foremost, one should ask the more basic question of what do women's coats of arms look like in various social and cultural contexts, even over longer periods, which is something Marie Grégoire has tried for France between the 14th and 16th century, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Then there's the question of differences between men and women. Is it even necessary to gender coats of arms, as we still do, at least subconsciously, or do contexts and symbolics not perhaps overlap far more than we assume? Is there, for example, a female heraldic code? Marie Grégoire would say no. And finally, thinking broadly, precisely because of the heraldic omnipresence of which I spoke in the beginning, what implications do such overlaps or non-overlaps of female and male heraldic practice entail? What role does gender play at all in the design, application, and reception of coats of arms? All of which really exciting questions, but unfortunately too vast for a single dissertation, which is my role in this project after all. So I have narrowed down my focus to heraldry of women in monasteries and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, collegiate churches.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. So the research questions or research questions, plural, concern heraldic communication of identity in communal ecclesiastical spaces. That is within the social and spiritual communities of monastic and collegiate women, and against the backdrop of the tension between individual and the group, which interests us in the broader research project. And then, of course, the value of the individual within such a relatively institutionalized space. The most important sources for me will be, to name a few examples, seals, stained glass, tomb slabs, especially liturgical objects, mobile liturgical objects, and possibly, I think, proofs of ancestry. So the social space of monasteries and collegiate churches is particularly compelling for the question of communication of identity, because here the collective identity of the place occupies so much space at first glance that the interplay or contrast or coexistence with the individual identity of, let's say, an abbess or a canoness or even a nun is not necessarily immediately apparent. So into this research question, which you see here, aspects from the questions I raised earlier also feed in, including the tracing of heraldic dynamics over a longer period, comparisons with male institutions, examination of double monasteries, hopefully, and with that also the question of dynamics and significance of gender in the lived monastic life. As for the research landscape on women and ecclesiastical heraldry, the whole thing is equally discouraging is a hard word, but there isn't a lot in sum. To outline the state of research a bit, we are speaking, as far as I know, of fewer than 10 case studies located in German-speaking areas, in present-day Belgium and in Portugal. All of these case studies, I have displayed the most relevant ones here, represent the same issue we face in heraldic research generally, namely that of a lack of comprehensive statistics, which leaves me with the task of conducting a larger scale study of women's heraldry in monasteries and collegiate churches that hopefully enables an evaluation and a comparison of geographical and temporal developments, but also allows for comparisons between female and male institutions. What these studies here, however, show really nicely, actually, is the diversity of sources, because each study examines different heraldic media. Among these are set proofs of ancestry, we have furnishings, we have liturgical objects, fixed architectural design elements, and particularly portals in that context, but also tomb slabs. Not to forget textual sources such as revenue registers, records, and testaments. What stands out to me in that research landscape is that armorial seals, or abbesses seals specifically, are absent. So I hope in my dissertation I can do justice or retain this transmedial heraldic communication space that would be my goal for the end of my PhD. So much for gender history for now and its potentials for heraldic research. Um, but I think that's not all because we do want to explore all of this digitally, don't we? So to that end, Noah has brought us a few examples from the research environment itself.
Yeah, thank you. So back to the digital side, Vivian's brought a lot of interests, questions, and the overarching goal of what we want to do on the digital side of things is to construct a database, a portal through which people with similar interests in medieval identity can come and ask their questions. When did women bear arms? Whose arms did they display? In which context? And the last part of that, whose arms did they display in which context? That's about infrastructure that we need to actually be able to answer questions like that. Because the first problem is that we need to connect across databases, across countries, across source types. We are trying to connect historical records, and that's a dangerous thing to do if you do it naively. Because, and here's a very naive example, if you just match people based on first and last name, here, for example, Adam, it can give you a completely wrong connection to someone's life that actually isn't the person who's um, the bearer of these arms. And that happens a lot because we have similar names and we have limited information, lots of uncertainty in our memorials and fields sometimes as well. The same name can be entirely different people, same family name can be entirely different families. And what protects us from this is the idea of linked open data. That's a concept or a method in digital history, and it comes down to two things. Everything Every entity, that could be a person, an institution, or a coat of arms itself, gets one stable identifier, which means it's a unique code that relates only to that thing. And that's common throughout most of database work. And every statement about the thing, so the object, the person, the seal, is recorded together with the source and together with the person or group making the assertion, the factoid. This is also the way Wikipedia might work, where you have to carry citations. You can see which person wrote which part of the Wikipedia entry, and you can overwrite them, write a comment, write a different kind of interpretation. Um, to link the data between the different sources. In our context, we use on the German side something called the DND, which is the German National Library's authority file system, where they have for every book, for every person who's ever wrote a book, and for different entities mentioned in books, or different records that they keep, they have these unique identifiers. And we can connect these unique identifiers with our own corpus of seals, of monuments, of memorials, and because other projects also build on these unique identifiers. For example, the Germania Sacra, which is a research database that documents clerical institutions of the Holy Roman Empire and their personnel, such as the diocese, monasteries, and the people who held offices in them. They also connect their entity level, their person specific, their job specific information to this German National Library uh, identification system. And when we're linking all of these different databases to the same identification system, then we're finally able to do really cool things. We're able to answer really cool questions uh, that build on the work of not just our project, but all the projects that feed in to the system, hundreds, thousands of people. So I want to tell you a little bit about what might be possible and how we're trying to bring this together to answer certain questions. We have, for example, here three different databases, and each of them holds one part of the picture. The armorials give us a coat of arms for the family Blankenheim, but it's decontextualized. There's no person attached to it. A seal database, in this case, Sigilla, that we're integrating into our research environment, give us an act, someone who is sealing a document dated in 1377, and on the seal itself are the arms of the See of Strasbourg and the arms of the family standing side by side. These are two separate shields, both carrying heraldic information. And then we have the Germania Saga, this database of church records, church offices, and they have information about the bishopric of Strasbourg from 1375 to 1393. And through the anchor of this authority file, this unique identifier supplied by the German National Library, these three records can be tied together to inform us of one man, in this case, Friedrich von Blankenheim, and each source can be used together to put the fragments together to answer questions about the identity and the ways of expressing identity, not only as Bishop of Strasbourg, but also through family lineages and how those might be different, how those might connect differently. For example, in some cases, the bishopric here has no crown on the family lineage, whereas in the armorials of the family Blankenheim, there's often a crowned lion. And what questions might that raise? Is there a difference there? We can start answering those we can look into those questions. And how we would look into those questions, I want to bring in two different related concepts from digital humanities in general. And there are two different modes of working with data. The first one is what historians and humanists have always really done, and it's close reading of the source. We're looking at one object very, very carefully. This is the seal of Kunigunde de Reinach that we saw briefly at the beginning. She was an abbess of Andlau, and the legend reads Kunigundes de Rhin, and then the shield interrupts the text and it continues with Abe in Andeno. So the shield sits between her family name and it breaks the name Reinach apart. And it does not break the name of the abbey that she governed. On the object of her institutional authority, at the exact point where she names herself, the composition is tied to her natal family and not her office and role. Maybe that's a part where you can start asking questions. It's a close reading of an object to get information, and we can help use that to inform questions or find new questions to ask. Opposite of that, we have a second mode of reading sources, which is distant reading. We are looking at the whole corpus as a whole, trying to look at dynamics over time and over space. And here we profit from all these modeling decisions that we described at the start. Gender being recorded as a field, for example, with the seals database. Because the field exists, I can ask this corpus directly of the 26,000 sealers in the seals database with a recorded gender, about 1,800 are women. And that's about 7% only. If that's representative sample is unclear and something that is uncertain, and you would have to contextualize as well. And if we restrict that number of women to women that through connection to the Germania Sacra we know had a religious life, I get 409. And we know that most of these are abbesses from Fontevraud, Sainte-Croix, Camiron, and again, all these Alsatian houses mainly. And that's because we have a database here with the seal that is based primarily on French sealing records. And with the Germania Sacra, we have a database of people associated mainly with the Holy Roman Empire. So it's natural that we have this overlap in Alsace, where the Holy Roman and French houses necessarily overlap slightly. And this is all part of the context that we have to be aware of when constructing this database. How do we get these figures like that? These are not figures that are necessarily representative to medieval Europe as a whole, but they're coming from decisions such as looking at field only in the French borders or putting together people entities that worked in religious institutions in the Holy Roman Empire. These 409 are not just a number, they are also women whose practice Vivien can look into. They are a retrievable group with dates, with houses, offices, and arms, which means that we can look at Cunegonde's office or family, her expressions of self potentially in all the sources, in all the seals that she stamps and the heraldry that she uses. And we can look at if there's a shift over time. Does do these things differ by region or by rank or by foundation? And that's what's meant with this distant reading. We're not looking at specific sources, but we're looking at overall trends. And that relies on these modeling decisions that we've made. All of this comes together in the digital heraldry research environment, which is a system built on Research Space, which is an open platform developed by the British Museum to document records of objects and to show them online visually. Uh, it holds together the armorials, the seals, the monumental heraldry soon, and the authority data that we've been collecting, and we're looking to collect more and more heraldic corpora. We're not copying all the data into our project, but we're connecting to it with these unique identifiers. If you're interested in a single object, every seal has its page. You can do the close reading. You can look at the images, the legend, the dates, the sealers, and the coats of arms, how they're decomposed element by element. And if you're working on an institutional level, you can look at how we look over regions, over years, French and German names, abbesses, different roles that are of interest, such as abbesses. It builds on itself and it should be user-friendly. We want to make the decisions that go into putting this environment together deliberate, so you'll always be able to see who is claiming this relationship to a specific entity or who's claiming which description act that a coat of arms can be described in this or that way. These are those factoids again. Just to give you some dimensions, there are some 44,000 seals. There's 42,000 coats of arms. There's 195 armorial manuscripts with 80,000 coats of arms, and there's 30,000 sealers at this point, which adds up to about 2 million different sort of statements that are made about the coats of arms, about the objects, about the people there. It's a lot of data that's being put together. And where's all this going? At the moment, the environment is only an internal instrument of the project, but we're looking to release it publicly this fall. So if you are interested in getting access when it does release this fall, hopefully, you can go to the website and there should be a link where you can sign up for early access and give us your email, and we will let you know when the program is publicly available and let us know. Before finishing, I'd just like to come to some conclusions, and I'll hand over to Vivien maybe to start with the conclusions.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah, what are our conclusions? For me, the major conclusion really is that women did bear coats of arms. I think that needs to be underlined, and I hope to have shown here a glimpse, at least, of how broad the spectrum of female heraldic practice and the heraldic communication space of women could be. Heraldry of women as such can open new perspectives on understanding the stability and the dynamics of gender hierarchies in the European Middle Ages, which then in ecclesiastical spaces can be examined, among other things, relatively detached of marital status and perhaps somewhat more detached from the mentioned dominance of agnatic and male representation. Other than that, the social or rather communal space of monasteries and collegiate churches is, I believe, really well suited for the investigation of heraldic identity, specifically for women and for men, not because here corporate and individually shaped identities come together in one social fabric. And yeah, the examination of this tension is going to be the subject of my dissertation. And that's, yeah, those are the conclusions on my part.
And my conclusions are a bit of just a summary of some things that are relevant to digital history, just in general, and for this project. When we're turning objects, historical information into data, something that can be read by a computer, this is a process that requires selection and abstraction. It's tied very intimately to the people making this process happen. It's important to be aware of that. The process also involves, and the historical record necessarily also involves, a high degree of uncertainty, which has very many different forms. We've just talked about a few of them: ambiguity, vagueness, incompleteness. But instead of overgoing this uncertainty, we want to make sure that it's explicit. We want to make sure that the statements, the arguments that are being made, and that other people then might use to make their insights and make their arguments happen. We want to make sure that it's clear to everyone using the information that we provide what basis it's standing on. And it's on the basis of people, and people make interpretations, and people's interpretations can be countered, they can be interpreted differently. What gives us the opportunity to do that is a shared ontology, a shared language for describing the world around us, a shared way of representing knowledge that hopefully then can allow close and distant reading of our sources and allowed for many different questions to be asked and answered in the future. I think we'd finish with that. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, and if you found something interesting in it.